Hey there, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rule, y'all. I am your host, Dr. Chea Parton, and this is a show where we talk all things rural YA literature and to the writers who write it, and now to the readers who read it. If you didn't get a chance to listen to our previous episode, pause now and go over and listen to that one. I talk with pre-service teachers Grace and Maya about their reading of Gary Eldon Peter's The Complicated Calculus and Cows of Carl Paulsen. And we had a great conversation, not only about the book, but also about the importance of rural experiences for pre-service teachers. So I highly, highly recommend that you check that out. It was awesome. I'm currently in my office watching it spit snow, which is fun. It's so great to be back in the Midwest, especially for a Midwestern winter. It's been a while since I was in Texas for 8 years, and I am enjoying it. I don't think everyone in my family is, but I know that I am. I can tell this is home for me, and so I'm really excited to be back. Speaking of Midwesterners, Gary Eldon Peter, the author featured on this episode, is a fellow Midwesterner. And so it was fun to talk with him about Midwestern things. And I just really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you so much for being here and joining us. One of the things that I was most fascinated about with Gary and my conversation is thinking about out-migrants and the identity building of second-generation out-migrants. So I'm a first-generation out-migrant. My parents, at least my mom and my stepdad, still live on our family farm, and they still work that ground. I don't live there anymore. I don't. And so I am an out-migrant. And then my children then are second-generation out-migrants. And like Gary, they go back and they visit the farm, and they go down, the quarter mile down the road, and they feed the cows at the neighbors, and they have connections to the farm in that way. And then also through my parents and me, who are also from farmers. So they're connected to farm people, so they're connected to farm culture, but they're living in a subdivision. And so I think a lot about how that is going to impact their identity building and who they see themselves as in terms of how they are connected to the land and to the earth. And so I just really appreciated that part of our conversation. It's really fascinating to me to think about, and hopefully it'll be fascinating to you too. It is the Christmas season, so if you are feeling like you want to give back to Literacy in Place, my website, or to Reading Rule Y'all, this podcast, you can do so by telling a friend about it, letting people know, continuing to get the word out about the work that we are doing over here in terms of rural representation in YA literature and middle grades literature. You could also leave a hopefully positive review on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. That helps the algorithm gods let other people know about us and help other folks who are interested in this kind of thing find this podcast. So I greatly appreciate that. And then if you are interested in participating in a book talk episode and you like to read rural YA or middle grades literature, please reach out and contact me. You can find us on social media at Literacy in Place, on Instagram at Reading Rural, on X, or the abomination that is X and previously was Twitter. And you can also find me on Facebook at Literacy in Place. And then if you go to literacyinplace.com, you can send me a message via my contact form. So reach out if you have any ideas for things you'd like to talk about, or books that you'd like to read, or if you have suggestions for books that you would like us to feature on the show. I would be glad to hear from you. So with that, thank you for doing what you can, and we will get to the episode. Hello, and welcome back to Reading Rule, y'all. I'm your host, Dr. Chea Parton, and I am so excited to be talking to Whippoorwill Award winner and fellow Midwesterner Gary Eldon Peter, whose debut novel, The Complicated Calculus and Cows of Carl Paulsen, published by Fitzroy Regal House, has won a number of other awards, including the Achievin Book Prize for Young Adult Fiction. It was also named one of the best young adult books of 2022 by National Public Radio and received the Minnesota Book Award. the Silver Award in the Forward Review's Indies Book of the Year Awards for Young Adult Fiction, and, like I said earlier, now the Whippoorwill Book Award for Rural Young Adult Literature. Currently a faculty member in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota, Gary teaches courses in writing, law, and popular culture, and the future of work and technology to both undergraduate and graduate students. He has worked as a judicial law clerk and as a lawyer in private law practice, and spent many years working in the legal publishing industry. He holds an MFA in creative writing from Sarah Lawrence College, as well as a JD from William Mitchell College of Law. Thank you so much for joining me in conversation, Gary. I'm so happy to be chatting with you today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really so happy to be here.
So I always start these interviews the same way, with a question about where are you from and how has that impacted who you are as both a person and a writer?
Well, I grew up in Austin, Minnesota, which is probably best known for Spam. Not the computer kind, but the canned kind. That's where I spent my formative years. And Austin is kind of not a small town, but not a big town. It's around, I think when I was living there, it was around 30,000 people. It's about couple hours south of the Twin Cities area. So that's where I grew up. In terms of my other background, in terms of where I'm from, in terms of rural, my father grew up on a farm, and I spent a lot of time as a child on my grandparents' farm. My mother also grew up in rural communities. So while I guess I'm sort of maybe more second generation rural connection, but still, because of my parents, feel pretty connected to that as part of kind of my upbringing and kind of formative years, spending a lot of time in rural communities myself.
What kind of farm? Was it like crop farming? Was it a dairy farm like in the book?
My dad's farm was both. They did crops and they had cows as well. And yeah, the story of my father's farm is really kind of interesting. My father was one of five kids, and he was the middle child and had two older brothers who were twins, and then two younger sisters who were also twins. So my dad was kind of the non-twin of the family. And my father's father, who would be, of course, my paternal grandfather, died quite young, in his mid-40s. And at that point, my father and his two older brothers ran the farm along with my grandmother. And then my father left the farm to go to college and kind of changed his what he was doing at that point, went in and became a businessman and had a lot of different jobs and such. But my uncles, who were bachelors, continued to run the farm along with my grandmother. And even after my father left farming, he was still very much involved in the running of the farm and decisions around the farm and all of that. And as I said, we would frequently be there a lot. And then on my mother's side, I had cousins who were farmers, and a cousin who I was quite close to was fairly close to my own age, and I would spend a lot of time in the summers on that farm. So I sort of had farms on both sides, in which I kind of absorbed a lot about what it was like to work on a farm. I think it's different when you're a kid, and it feels a little bit more kind of like play. And I don't know that I really appreciated then how hard a job it was, and what it was to really make that your living. And it was really only in looking back and kind of thinking about it, trying to understand what that was like. And I really wish my father's since passed away, and I think we all sort of have regrets like this. I really wished I'd talked to my father even more about, well, what was that like to run the farm, and have that be kind of your job, and to also be in the family doing that job. And so I think a lot of that is why I wanted to write about it, to kind of imagine that for myself.
I think that makes a lot of sense. In the work that I do, even just my research, I work a lot with like rural out-migrants, so folks who are raised rurally and then ended up moving out. And so I talk and think and write a lot about, it's not just about like where you're from, but it's also about who you're from, because
Mm-hmm.
cultural practices stay with you. Like place really stays with you even as you move around. And so I always call myself an Appalachian infused Hoosier, because most of my dad's family came from East Tennessee, and they sort of moved up in the Great Migration of the 40s to look for work, because as my Uncle Leroy says, we was starving down there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of a similar story. They worked on they didn't own the farms um, because we weren't that well off. But they worked them, and it's kind of a similar situation. Like my grandpa Bob's dad died when he was really young, and so as like a 17 or 18-year-old kid, like he was like the breadwinner of the household, and there were 6 kids to feed, and so he worked for a local farmer in Tipton, Indiana, who offered to pay to send him to college, and he said no, thank you. Because he knew he needed to make money for the family. And so kind of an opposite, trajectory of that kind of story. He
Mm-hmm.
ended up working in factories his whole life. But anyway, so I think like I grew up around them, and I still grew up on a farm. But um, I think that just the way that culture moves with people, and the way that rural culture moves with rural people, even when they leave rural places, I think is really powerful, and connects people in a way that maybe a lot of folks don't realize. And I've had those same moments too, where like, oh, I wish I would have sat down with, my grandpa Adam and asked him these questions about what it was like to do these things. And when I was growing up, we had kind of paused like working our own land, and we were renting it out, and now they're farming it again. And so I kind of like was in this like space of like, I remember we had hogs for a while, and I was young, and I still helped with the hogs, but then we got rid of them because my stepdad was tired of dealing with them and didn't feel like they
Mm-hmm.
were worth it anymore. And then he started doing some construction work and started trying to do some other things, and we had 80 acres. I think it was like 50 of tillable land. And instead of working it ourselves, because he didn't have time for that, because he was doing other things, we, rented it out to other people. And then once, it was like on the tail end of me living there and like starting to go to college and that kind of stuff, that they started working it again. And so I feel like I did grow up on a farm, and we did have livestock, and we did farm crops, but just kind of, by 2 degrees of separation or whatever. And so a lot of the writing that I do too is like trying to figure out then like what my rural identity is, and where it sits on the spectrum of what rural identities look like,
Right.
because of that. So I think that that's a really great experience to share, and to help us think about, what does it mean to be rural?
Mm-hmm.
Who gets to
Mm-hmm.
claim that identity, and what does that look like? And um anyway, so thanks for sharing. I really appreciate that. I think it's got my wheels turning.
Yeah, well, and for us, even in our family now, we still have some of that land that was originally farmed by um, my grandparents, and then later my dad, and then later after that my uncles. And we used to have a lot more, and it sort of got um, sold off for various reasons. And people had my uncles had their shares, and they kind of did something different with them. And then, but we've hung on to, I think we have like 160 acres left, which we which we still have, and we rent. and because of the way my father's sort of estate stuff was set up, every year I get a report on how that land is doing, and I get pictures, and it's really interesting. And it rotates. Some years it's corn, some years it's soybeans, and we get this incredibly detailed report from the agent that works for the bank that has the land in trust, and how is it doing, and how is the renter, is he doing a good job, and what's the weather been like, um, and I've never, I mean, I've always thought about maybe I should go visit that land just to see it for myself. I see the pictures and I read about it, and a lot of the kind of farming stuff goes over my head. It's kind of really pretty technical. But it's still, yeah, there's something about having it that is really special still, and it's a connection to our past, and to our dad and his dad, and even beyond that. And so, yeah, even though I didn't live there technically, I still feel it's still important to me, and kind of who, part of who I am, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there's a lot of stuff wrapped up in land. There's a lot of
Yeah.
cultural things, there's a lot of identity things, and there's a lot of like fiscal capital things that all connect together to sort of make us who we are, whether we're on that land or not,
Yeah. Yeah. And even I have such vivid memories of the house where that was on the land, because where my grandmother lived, and just I can I have really strong sense memories of it, just in terms of smell, and just what it looked like. And um uh one of my sisters, we knew that the farm, the farmstead itself was being sold, and that they were going to tear down that house. And my sister went in, and I'm so glad she did this. I just wouldn't have thought to do this, but she went in to the house before it got torn down, and kind of took stuff, just like pieces of wood, and things like that. Um, and you wouldn't think that would be such a big deal, but I have those as well. She kind of shared those with the rest of us, and it's like, wow, so I have the land there, but I also have just the kind of the physicality of the space where, I remember being in that house and sitting around the table and listening to my dad and my uncles talk about farm stuff, right? Again, I don't really know what they talked about, but I can really, it still feels really vivid to me.
Yeah, I think it's amazing the way that objects sort of become infused with all of this meaning, all of the experiences. It's like they, start to embody it in a way, or I mean, we give it that meaning, but still, like the object itself is so important. And I know exactly what you're talking about, because as you were talking about your grandmother's house, I could smell my mom and papa,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And I remember my sister, even, this was, she was really into kind of antiques and stuff. And she rescued, this was, I think she was maybe even in high school at this point, but she rescued a hand plow, and kind of, cleaned it up and everything, and had it in her room. And then I think she also, and this was well after they no longer did any kind of dairy farming, she rescued a milk can, and I think she painted it and decoupaged it. But it was like, again, I'm like, and I know she still has those things, and it's like, oh, yeah, I'm so glad that someone thought to do that stuff. So
And
stay
I think that,
connected.
yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm a
Oh, it's
quote,
okay.
whatever.
Go
Um,
ahead.
um, and I think that all of what we're talking about, I can really see in the book. Carl's attachment to the farm, and his dad's struggle to sell it or not, especially after Carl's mom's death. And is the hardness, like the difficulty of running a dairy, and what that looks like, and how it can be so hard, but you can also really love it, like down to
Mm-hmm.
your
Mm-hmm.
bones, and not want to get rid of it. I think that a lot of what we're talking about in terms of like how identity gets tied up into place, and how those experiences um, build who we are. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think that that really comes through in we called it complicated when we were talking about it on the Whippoorwill committee. We always just shortened it to complicated calculus. Um,
Oh, okay.
so that's what I was tempted to say. But I think all of that gets picked up in the complicated calculus and cows of Carl Paulsen. And so that leads me kind of to my next question, which was like when you were writing this book, it feels to me like you couldn't think of it any other way than a rural book, but sometimes authors don't. And so I like to ask that question, and then with the follow-up question being, if you saw it as a rural book, then how or why was rurality important to you in the context of Carl's story? And I feel like you've kind of already started to talk a little bit about that, but would you like to say more?
Sure. Yeah, that was always the setting of the book. The book, I worked on it for a long, long time, and it was in earlier drafts. It was my original vision for it, I guess, was I was thinking of epic. I was gonna like write this. I don't know. I think of James Michener. Remember those books like Centennial, or they were like 1,000 pages long, and multiple generations and points of view. And I was going to really go back, into past generations and bring it to the present. And but so and obviously the book that it ended up being was much different than that. But the setting never changed. I never it was always going to be set on a farm, and so that was really important to me. And also, I just thought, in addition to wanting to sort of be able to write about something that's part of me and my family and my past and all of that, I just think that the setting of a farm setting, especially a farm setting where things aren't going so great, just presented a lot of really good opportunities for story and for conflict, and also to give um, the relationship between Carl and his dad an additional sort of dimension, I guess is maybe the word I'm thinking about. Because really, when it comes down to it, and I thought about this, in my own family, my father, in terms of his farm he grew up in, I mean, they weren't just siblings, they were like business partners,
Yeah.
I mean, they had to make decisions about what to do. And they kind of, my grandmother, was widowed very young and had these two younger daughters to care for, and just, all of the challenges of raising children on your own and all of that. And so I think, my impression has always been that my dad and my uncles really just kind of, they were it. And so when I thought about the novel, I thought that, in addition, I mean, there's a lot in the book about Carl's understanding his own identity and all of that. But also, I thought, they also are kind of in a business together, and how does that shape their relationship, and what is it like to be a teenager and have that kind of weight, maybe, of that to think about, and to have to think about things that maybe an urban 15-year-old wouldn't have to really worry about. You wouldn't think about what are we going to do if this fails, or what would be our next chapter if we left this, and what would that mean for us, not just financially but sort of emotionally, and given this kind of hovering of um Carl's mother and his father's wife and what she wanted. So that, the setting of the farm, I thought, just worked really, could just do a lot, just in terms of creating tension and conflict and uncertainty, and how are they going to resolve that, and what are they going to do? And so, and Carl's sort of balancing that with this kind of I guess infatuation, or maybe obsession, I don't know, with this kind of new kid in town, and what's his story, and what does that mean for him. But yeah, so I always wanted it to be where it was set, but it just took a lot of drafts, and to get really down to what the essential story was going to be, which ended up being pretty compact. I mean, it's hard to believe that in early drafts of the novel, I was 250, 300 pages, but then as I kept working on it and thought, well, what's the real story here? What's most important? A lot of stuff just kind of fell away, and it was like, I don't need to do, or I don't want to do, or I don't think can do a very good job of 3 different points of view and 3 timelines, and all of that. Maybe next novel, maybe, but I thought, yeah, I just really wanted it to be kind of this sort of really window of time, really important window in the life of these characters, and how are they, they got to make a decision, or they, time is sort of running out. What are they going to do? So, yeah. So I I don't know if I kind of answered the question, I think somewhat roundabout, but yeah, the setting was just so key to me, and it was all in sort of how I wanted to work with it and develop it. So.
And I think I'm glad you answered it in a roundabout way, because you brought up 2 other things that I thought were really important about the novel, and that is like the amount of heavy lifting and work that is done in so few pages. Like, it's incredible the amount of just learning and identity development, and there's a lot of stuff to dig into and unpack in just a few pages, which I thought was wonderful. Especially I really thought that Carl's relationship with his dad and the way that it played out across the page was really well done, really powerful, and really important, because with our limited point of view being Carl, the sort of communication or non-communication and the sort of assumptions that Carl's dad seems to be making about him and what he's thinking, and the assumptions that Carl is making about what his dad thinks instead of just talking about it, I think was a really important thing. And I think definitely speaks to adolescent relationships with parents, especially because Carl is like, a business partner in the farm. The sort of power dynamics that exist according to age in the text, and sort of, familial relationship, parent-child relationship. I thought that was really well done, and I thought it was a really important part of the book, and one that was really like rich and just perfect for a lot of critical analysis. So I thank you for that. I
Oh,
sometimes
thank
feel
you.
like sometimes I think it's so easy just to sort of simplify that relationship and make, the kid the victim and the parent the villain, or whatever. But that's not how it happens in your book, and I think that's really important. Um, do you have anything you want to say about that, or do you want to keep
Oh,
going?
no, I appreciate that. That's really nice to hear. Yeah, I think one thing I would just say is, yeah, it is a challenge, I think. And I think as a writer, like a lot of writers, I'm very kind of preoccupied with point of view, right? And what makes sense with that. And when I kind of decided, what, I'm just going to stick with one point of view here, and it's going to be a first person point of view, and it's going to be this kid. And what is that? How does that impact your telling of the story? And it is a very much and people have described it in reviews or in talking about it, like, oh, it's so interior, right? And that can be really nice because you can really explore one character and how they see the world and how they interact with it and everything, which is something that I really wanted to do. But it's hard because you're kind of, once you put yourself in there, it's like, well, now how are you going to make it work? And so that was really a challenge, and how to sort of how do you create other characters that that can feel full when you're sort of, it's one person telling the story. So trying to get across who Carl's dad was through Carl was a real challenge. And I didn't want and I wanted, I didn't want the dad to be like a villain and like pushing or saying we got to do this. I wanted him to sort of have some ambivalence, and so how to show that is really tricky. And also with um you know the character of Andy, who is kind of another central part of the book, and how to portray him through the eyes of Carl. Um and I don't think I'm giving too much away here, but when you do that, you want to show sort of a character maybe is maybe too good to be true, or there's red flags, but your character through his point of view, how do you kind of show that? How do you show, as the reader can kind of say, you know what, Carl, this guy maybe isn't such as bad news, or maybe is not what he seems. But how do you convey that, through one character, and that idea that the reader maybe knows more than the narrator knows, and how do you put that across, I think was a challenge in the book, to you kind of make your choices, and then you sort of have to live with them as a writer and make them work and do the best you can. So
And I think, I think a lot of that work comes from the things that the characters say. Like I think that I really got an idea of who Carl's dad was outside of Carl's assumptions of his dad through the things that his dad said in certain situations. And so, and Andy too. I think that you start to get a picture of these other characters based on what they say, and Carl can take what they say in whatever way that Carl does, but that doesn't mean that the reader has to. And based on other
yeah.
happened in the text, then you as a reader can sort of read between the lines and maybe see other things that Carl doesn't see. And so I think that you did a really excellent job of that, actually.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I hadn't really thought about quite that way, so that's really great to hear. Yeah, dialogue is kind of your best friend, I think. When as a writer, you kind of have all these tools, right? You have setting and different, kind of your range of things you can use. But yeah, I think that, yeah, and I hadn't really thought about it quite that way. But yeah, I think I did rely on dialogue. Not as much for Carl, who does speak in the book, but like I said, a lot of it's so internal. But yeah, dialogue is a way for those other characters to kind of show more who they are, and kind of gives you a little bit of a broader way of conveying things than than that make first person maybe a little harder to do sometimes. So yeah.
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 The other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking a bit ago was Andy's character, actually. A lot of the books that I've read as part of the Whippoorwill Committee, there seems to be this trend of like a character fleeing in an urban place to come into a rural place. And then usually that character becomes the focus of the story and like what they learn from being on their great aunt's farm or whatever. And so like this idea of like out migration, in migration is really interesting to me because that's my research area. But also just the kind of the ways that it exposes aspects of culture that are related to place, I think is really important, because I think a lot of times we think about, we don't really think about place as culture or how place shapes culture. And so, for example, when I was interviewing a lot of the teachers that I was working with in my study, a lot of them said, like, I didn't think I had a culture. I mean, they grew up in rural towns, but they didn't think they had a culture, because culture was something that others have, right? Like capital O others, like that
Mhm,
is culture,
mhm,
but like what they have isn't culture. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that we think about whiteness as like, the default or whatever, which obviously is problematic. But also like rural white experiences are different than suburban and urban white experiences. And so I think that when we have these sort of in-migrant, out-migrant like movement across places and stories, that sort of comes to the surface. And so I was really excited by Andy's appearance in the novel and the way that Carl thinks about how he doesn't have to do chores, and how that's like bullcrap, and just sort of there's different understandings of the world, and their different understandings of the rural place where the book is set. And so I thought, Andy was a really important character, and the fact that he came from a different place, but came from people in the place where Carl is from, was a really complex thing to sort of think about. And if I were teaching this in a class, that is absolutely something that I would want to dig into, because I think it's important, and I was just really happy to see it in the
mhm,
book.
mhm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Andy was kind of, I think I always kind of knew who Carl was, and I think I always knew who his dad was and various other people, and Ellen, the kind of the person who is sort of part of the family, but sort of not, and living with them. And Andy was yeah, I think that was a challenge for me, because I wanted him to kind of resist what Carl sort of knows about himself and has always known, and his connection, even if he might not be able to articulate it, the importance to him of who they are as farmers, and their connection and what they do. And to have someone kind of come in and challenge that, I guess, um and yeah, and to not, and to just, yeah, I mean, again, because it's a business, it's like, well, from an early age, and my understanding from, my father's upbringing, and cousins farmers, and who are farmers and such, that's just, you start at a very early age, doing a lot of stuff. And Andy is just like, I'm not having it, and it's like, well, how long is that going to last? And for Carl to sort of come up against that and think, well, how could you ever think that? And he's not so much put off by it, but just more kind of fascinated by it, or like, here's someone who who would not do that, and how is that possible? And yeah, and so I think maybe the easier thing would have been to just have Andy sort of adapt. And that's maybe what they have in common, is that they're both now 15-year-olds helping to run farms. Um, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted Andy to sort of be, kind of present himself as something that, um, that Carl could kind of look at and say, this is just, a new world for me, and he was a new world for him in a lot of other ways, but that in particular, I think was important, to have someone who did have connections through his own family, but himself was like, just didn't really want any part of it. So
Yeah. And that sparked a thought for me about ideas about like rural masculinity.
mhm,
Um, because in a conference presentation, Jeff Zentner once said that he wrote In the Wild Light because he wanted to show that there is a tenderness, there's a tender masculinity in rural places, but that's not something that often gets shown because rural life is so hard, because farming is so hard. A lot of the depictions of rural masculinity includes this like hardness and this a lot of times anger for some reason. And so he wanted to showcase like that there are different forms of real masculinity, and tenderness exists there. And so when I was thinking about sort of the differences between Carl and Andy and like the way that they perform masculinity, it's interesting to me because Andy tries to come off as this like, I don't give a shit about anything, I'm not going to do what they tell me to do. Like he has this like rebellious sort of fierceness, which we often and anger, which we often associate right with masculinity. But Carl's not like that. He's thoughtful. He's not like Andy in that way. And so I think that the two of them together showcase different ways of being masculine that I think also invite really rich analysis. And then we haven't really mentioned yet, but the layering of rurality and queer identity is also really interesting and really important because, and that's another thing that I really loved about this book is that like Carl knew who he was and he accepted himself and he was from the rural place, right? Like he was the rural person, and he accepted his queer identity. But Andy, who was from the non-rural place, was the one who seemed to be struggling to accept himself, and his identity. And so being in that rural place, rural places often get depicted as these centers of homophobia, but hatred knows no zip code. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that the way that they are both working on building an understanding of themselves and who they are, in their non-rural identities and how those are layered with their queer identities, was really, really important.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was really, I knew fairly early on, and as I said, in many drafts, but I knew fairly early on that as far as Carl and his own acceptance, I wanted it to just be there. I didn't want to write a book, right? I didn't want the character, and there are plenty of wonderful books that do this, but I didn't want it to be, oh, am I or aren't I, and what do I do if I am? And I wanted to do something a little different, and I wanted to just establish pretty clearly early on and have him kind of just speak to the reader pretty directly and say, you know what, this is who I am, and I'm okay with it. I don't know how the rest of the world feels about it. That's kind of where I'm at right now, is how do I negotiate that with other people and with family. But I know who I am, and I'm good with it. And so that, to do that, really kind of came as a relief to me, to kind of know that I could do that, or I felt like I could do that. And then the story could be much more about, okay, how is who I am fit with the world, or do I have to fit myself to the world, or the world, how will the world understand me, and how am I going to figure all that out? But yeah, there was never a moment, I mean, there is never a moment where he's like, boy, maybe I'm really not. And that question kind of gets more kind of explored with Andy, I think, and Carl has to figure out, well, maybe, just because you're pretty okay with who you are doesn't mean someone else is, and what are you going to do about it? So yeah, so that was really something that if nothing else worked in the book, I was going to make that work. That I was going to have Carl have that sort of feeling about himself. That was really important.
And I think he never really asks whether it's okay or not either. Like it's not. And you kind of said that at the beginning of your response that he's like, this is who I am, and I'm okay with it. And he does work to sort of figure out how, like, what that means for his interactions with this outside world, but there's never this question of like, well, maybe it's wrong to be me. Like
Mhm,
maybe it's wrong
mhm,
to be who I am. He never,
mhm.
at least I don't remember that being something
Yeah.
that he ever thinks. And so I think that's really important too, because I think, when we think about mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors, like it's important that there are books out there, like, the sort of problem novel, where queer kids are trying to figure out their sexuality. I think those are important because that is an experience. But it's also an experience to know who you are, and to be okay with that, even if the outside world isn't. And so having that experience like mirrored back to you, or being able to see that through a window, I think is also really important. And so I'm glad that you chose to do it that way in this book, and
Mhm.
that this book exists for those kind of readers.
Yeah. Well, and also just to, to not assume just because we are where we are time-wise right now, that of course, in a rural community, of course, he would be accepted and wouldn't maybe be bullied or this or have this happen. I think, communities are different and levels of acceptance are different. And we're not all in that same place of where someone, an urban 15-year-old would be as opposed to a rural 15-year-old to be. And I didn't want to overdo that, but I just think that, you know, that's still there. I mean, unfortunately, I mean, I think there is still homophobia and bullying and distrust and um os being ostracized and all of that. That's still, I would love to say, oh, that's all in the past. It's not, it just isn't. And that's kind of a reality.
Yeah. And that's one thing that we often talk about on the committee, and something that I think a lot about with my work with rural YA is that so much of the story of rural America that's previously been told is negative, and
Hmm.
there's this like overarching dominant narrative, this single story. And so we need books that counteract that story, but also we don't need books that 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 don't tell it all, that sort of become a single story of their own. um,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so because rarely is one town or one community one thing, because there are a lot of different people. Even in small communities, there are different people who have different ideas and beliefs and opinions, and identities. And so when we bring people together, like things don't get simpler, they get more complex.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so thinking about having a range of, and not just trying to balance the scales with books that take a positive spin, but also have books that take a critical look at, these are things that happen in these times, in these places. These things also happen in other places.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but they also happen here. And so, what do we think about that? What do we do with that? How do we continue to progress and, stay true to what we think of and what we mean when we say that we're rural, but how do we also grow in that and not just, stay in this kind of static um, identity that, because when things stay static, they die. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
so, how do we not do that? And so I think that your book helps us think about that and gives us a space that's kind of like outside of the news cycle, and it just gives us a kind of a third space to think
Hmm.
about it, I guess.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, do you have any other parting words of advice for young people or teachers who want to pursue writing as either part of their career or their career?
Never give up. I'm kind of the I'm a prime example of that, of someone who it took many, many years for both my books to get published. And it, you know, I wouldn't say, oh, it was wonderful all the way along. You know, it was challenging. I was often wanted to give up. I came very close to giving up on this novel. And because I just couldn't, you know, it just wasn't, I don't know, it just took me a while. I don't to figure it out. And you know, as terrible as these last few years have been for us, you know, for everybody, I say this in just kind of very gingerly. I kind of sort of, I don't know that I would have finished the novel in the form that it is now without the pandemic. And when I'm just going back to that really terrible spring of 2020, when, you know, kind of overnight everything shut down, and it was just a really, that spring and that summer was really, you know, people were pretty much hunkered down, and we were as well, me and my partner. And I had a lot of plans for that summer. I was going to I had a month-long writing residency all set to go in Italy, which was thrilled about. Of course, that didn't happen. And I was, you know, just in, I guess, a funk. I guess that's the best way to put it. And I was like, well, you know, what do I want to do with this summer? You know, and how do I make it productive? And I kind of just sort of said to myself, you know what, I'm going to rewrite this novel. I'm going to finish this novel. I'm going to, if it's the last thing I do, kind of. And so I very deliberately went back, started at page 1, and I rewrote it. I mean, not just in the sense of, oh, I reread it and then, oh, I'm going to add a sentence here. I you know, sat down at the computer, page 1, and rewrote every word of it. And at the end of the summer, I thought I have a pretty decent draft here. I think this feels like a much different book. I think this is what it was meant to be. I'm gonna send it out into the world, see what happens. And, you know, it got taken. And so I guess the advice in all of that is just, yeah, don't give up. And yeah, when you think something you can't do any more with it, go back to it one more time. Because if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have published the book and be talking to you and get these wonderful awards like the one that you've been a part of. So yeah, and things take their time, and you can't control that, and accept that, I think, is other advice. And that there are times in your life when you're not able to write for a lot of reasons. You're just not in a place because of other things happening in your life or commitments or whatever. So yeah, I think that yeah, you have to decide for yourself how important it is, and if you're gonna you know, if you're going to give up or not. And maybe you will, and that's fine, and everyone maybe reaches that point with writing sometimes. But you know, don't resist. Give it one more try, I think, is really important. And also just, yeah, don't, I mean, I had people who passed on this book because the very things that others have liked about it, they didn't like. They said it's too internal, right? We need more action. We need a car chase. They didn't say that, but you know what I mean. And
Make this a
or
My
multiple
Play
car
feature.
chases. Yeah. You just never know who, you know, it's so much in the timing of things. And when you write, and especially when you try to publish, who is reading and who is at any given time. You just never know. And you can't predict things. I know with my first book, which I also got published through a competition, I submitted it for a book competition, and I knew ahead of time who was judging that, and I looked him up. And I thought, never. This person is so far away from how I write and what I do and what's, my subject matter. There's just no way. And I was totally wrong. Good writing is good writing, and you don't have to, if someone else is reading it, you just don't know. You can just never predict how people are gonna respond. So I guess as speaking as a writer, I guess that's the advice I have is,
Well, thanks again for being here and chatting with me, and
oh,
congratulations
thank
again
you.
on winning the Whippoorwill. And I will keep my eye out for an essay collection.
Oh, well, yeah, give me a year or two or more if any past history is any indication. But no, thank you. I've so enjoyed our talk. And again, I'm just so honored to have my work recognized. This is such a great uh, fit for my book in terms of what I tried to do. And for that to be recognized is really, I'm just so grateful and honored. And it was really special to be receiving it. So thank you.